You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on legalising prostitution. The Oxford Union, the prestigious debating society of Oxford University, has just hosted a debate on whether prostitution is a legitimate business activity. It's not the first time the union has courted controversy, but the topic is part of a wider discussion in British society about sexual freedom and the increasing sexualisation of society. There's a growing demand from campaigners to regulate prostitution, even though the act is not technically illegal at the moment. The aim is to make the world's oldest profession a safer activity for those involved. To discuss the issue, I'm joined by feminist writer and founder of Justice for Women, Julie Bindel, porn star and prostitute Johnny Ongley. Carrie Mitchell is from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Roger Matthews is a professor of criminology at the University of Kent. Roger, I want to begin with you, Professor of Criminology. What do we mean when we say prostitution isn't illegal, but the activities around it, such as pimping, soliciting and brothel keeping, are?
Well, basically what it says, which is that the actual act of prostitution itself is not illegal in this country, but most of the ways in which you might engage in prostitution, and certainly those forms where prostitution involves, for example, working in brothels and whatever, all those forms of activity all come under some form of regulation.
Now, Johnny, you famously worked as a male prostitute. Do you see it as a business and a job like any other?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's a way of making a living for me, and the way I do it in a very open and honest way. I work for myself. I advertise my services on a website. I'm very open with the clients who want to contact me for my services. We speak beforehand. I usually ask for pictures to make sure I would be comfortable working with them. So it's a very honest and open contract, basically, I have with those people. And yes, it helps pay my bills, basically.
No, it's if you could remove the exploitation from the industry, if you could remove the pimps and the profiteers, if you could remove the danger towards those actually working in the sex industry. And although, you know, you're hearing from Johnny, it is primarily women who are working in prostitution in the UK and certainly around the world, then that would be a different matter. The act of prostitution, the buying and selling of other people's bodies, particularly when it's men buying women, is not conducive to equality. So therefore it affects all women. It gives the impression that our bodies can be commodified. This isn't a moral argument. It's not an anti-sex argument. Sex is great. Sex is brilliant. The point is that when men feel that they can give money, give dollars, or whichever currency in order to rent the inside of a woman's body, then it devalues her and it creates the context in which men think that they can treat women as inferior.
Carrie Mitchell from the English Collective of Prostitutes. Is prostitution just a commodity?
Well, it's the exchange of sexual services for money, and it's sex between consenting adults, not to be confused with trafficking and rape, which is force. And we are campaigning and have been for a long time for decriminalisation of prostitution. That is, removing prostitution from the criminal law so that consenting sex between adults is not an offence, but, you know, rape, force, underage offences are still unlawful. The only place that decriminalisation has taken place successfully is in New Zealand, and there they have found there's been no increase in prostitution. And most importantly, because women don't fear being arrested, they're more able to come forward and report violence to the police. And also importantly, up to 4 women are able to work together collectively with nobody in charge, without requiring any kind of a special licence, so that this provides a choice for women, so that the power of the brothel owners is reduced. The question of women on the street is the same. I mean, in New Zealand, again, women have started to be able to come off the street because they have a choice. And in this country, Ms Bindel, in fact, although she says that she's for women's safety and sex worker safety, has been backing repressive legislation which has resulted in increased powers for the police to go after sex workers. And as a result, it's also a racist policy because the police target immigrant sex workers and use that as an excuse to increase deportations. So it's not to be confused between decriminalisation, which we want, and legalisation, which the bosses want, and trafficking and force, which is a forced situation, and prostitution, which is consenting sex. So it's very important to keep those distinctions clear.
I want to give Julie Bindel the right reply. You're a feminist writer. So you're backing a racist policy?
No. That is a gross misrepresentation. The legislation that I suggested a long time ago, in part supported, criminalises the demand. So in other words, whoever is paying for or attempting to pay for sex, whether it's a man or a woman, would be criminalised. We're talking about being fined and that money going back into services to help women exit. And also for the decriminalisation of anyone who's selling sex to be decriminalised.
This is based on the Swedish model then?
Yes, it is. And there's real problems with the New Zealand model. For example, decriminalisation has not, and this is in the New Zealand government's own report of the legislation, has not meant that women who suffer sexual violence in prostitution feel any more able to report those crimes to the police.
Lie.
It's in their own report.
That is an absolute... And I'll send it to you. No, there has been a government report. It was built into the laws in New Zealand. A 5-year report was required. And that is exactly, as I say, what it found. And it did certainly find that women were more able to, and it makes obvious sense that if you're not going to, be arrested if you come forward and report violence, you're going to do so, and women are doing so. That's one of the first findings that the report found, and of course it's one of the most important.
Johnny Anglais, prostitute and porn star.
I just want to say here that as far as I'm concerned, there are two debates going on here, both of which Julie Bindel disagrees with. First of all, it's the principle of prostitution, whether you disagree with the principle of buying and selling sex. I think it's a service which is helpful. I think it helps provide, make for a better society. Then there's also
why does it make a better society?
Well, I think it's a human need, which is not quite as important as being the need to eat and drink and the need to breathe. And people recognise that if you're not being sexually satisfied, that it can cause things like stress, anxiety, and a whole load of other things voids in your life. So sometimes being in the company of another human being is something which you cannot get from just being on your own. You need sometimes to have that is something that you feel the need to do. And if you can reach a contract with somebody which is honest and open in exchange for some money, then I think that's a service which is very helpful. The other debate about, because some people who work within prostitution do things which are wrong, where else in our lives do we use that argument? Do we say, because some factory workers put toxins and pollutants out into rivers and streams, because they abuse their workers, because they don't pay them a decent wage, that we shouldn't have a manufacturing industry? Of course we don't. What we do is we say we tackle those problems, we tackle the things which are being done which are illegal, like the trafficking, like the people being kept as slaves in homes properties up and down this country. We deal with those issues. We don't say, well, let's ban the whole thing. Our attitude needs to change to prostitution. We need to, ideally, what I want is I'd like our society to be able to say, look, let's recognise it as a service. Let's not say the people who work within are sleazy, the people who want the service are sleazy, and recognise it's a service which is helpful in our society.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on legalising prostitution. I'm joined by feminist writer Julie Bindel, porn star and prostitute Johnny Anglais, Carrie Mitchell from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Roger Matthews, a professor of criminology at the University of Kent. With the first argument that Johnny brought up, Roger Matthews, Johnny said if there is an open contract between two people, we shouldn't get involved. It has some benefits to society. Absolutely. Roger, would you agree?
I think with Johnny's position, and as Julie Bindel was saying, I think, where there's no exploitation, where it's a contract between two people, then it's a different entity. The problem is that very often a great deal of prostitution does involve degrees of exploitation. It does involve degrees of coercion. And basically, I think in response to Carrie's point, is that, we've just conducted a sort of national study talking to a lot of women involved in on-street and off-street prostitution. And what's remarkable about that is actually about how many women would like to get out. And that itself seems to me to carry a very strong message about the sort of dangers and problems of women involved in prostitution.
So what?
Roger,
so what, Roger
1 second.
Matthew?
Roger, what do you think is needed to protect sex workers then? Are the models that we've discussed sufficient?
No, I think what is quite clear is if you actually protect... most of the women that we've interviewed, particularly women working on the street, I have not interviewed a woman working on street in prostitution who's not had some life-threatening experience. And we're talking about, and that's really a tip of a very large iceberg of coercion. Most of these women live in a very coercive environment. They get coercion from punters, they get coercion from pimps, they get coercion from other sources.
Is that just a matter of protecting these women then and putting in the safeguards that are necessary?
Well, the protection which seems obvious, and the protection which most of them seem to want, is actually to get out. You can talk about women reporting to the police, and you can talk about ugly mugs campaigns and all these sorts of things. But ultimately, on a day-to-day basis, both women working on street and off street are faced with threats to their well-being on all sorts of levels, and basically a lot of these women, given the opportunity, would like to get out of that environment. And really what we should be doing is thinking about ways to help them do that.
Carrie Mitchell, most of the people want to get out of this environment, and we should be helping them out of prostitution.
Absolutely. The first point is that Roger Matthews said that I think he said all the women who he'd met, he interviewed who were working outdoors, had experiences of violence. Yes, that is because the police do not come forward and protect sex workers from violence. Women cannot report to the police. Most women don't report to the police out of fear of arrest, and that's what's happening at the moment. 2, yes, people do want to get out of prostitution, but I don't hear Roger Matthews say, go at the government about the welfare reform bill, which is driving women, has done away with social security, the money, welfare that, for instance, mothers relied on. And it's mostly mothers who are sex workers supporting families.
But is that really going to draw them to prostitution? Is that really going to push them there?
Poverty draws, and lack of choices draws women into prostitution, and that is what has to be dealt with, and that is what the government is destroying at the moment. As we all know, every single cut the government makes is going after women and young people first, and then people say women shouldn't be going into prostitution. What are women supposed to do? And we'd like to hear from those who would stop women and prevent women from going into prostitution.
I'm going to let Julie reply to the second one, that we shouldn't tarnish the whole industry. What are your thoughts?
Well, the psychological effect on women and men in prostitution are there to see. There are a number of reports, of studies, of testimonies by people who have exited prostitution, who have left, who say that at the time that they were involved in the industry, they would defend it, they would say this is great. And Johnny is presenting a utopian vision of a prostitution exchange.
Well,
for the majority of women in prostitution, they are not there because it's their first choice. They do not suddenly wake up and think, I want to actually have a man penetrating me several times a day for money. Now, of course there are jobs that are hideous.
Well,
of course there are jobs.
So let Carrie reply to this.
You know nothing about my background, Carrie. The point is that neither of your guests in the studio today are representative of the majority of disenfranchised women in prostitution.
Of course, but I'm representing a side of prostitution that I know. I can only speak for the side of prostitution which
and it's
I
the only
know,
voice that we hear.
Well, no, because you also, as you just stated, you hear from people who've had bad experience of prostitution. I know people who've had bad experience of all sorts of jobs. Absolutely, there are people who have bad experience of prostitution.
Sure, let's
people
let
have good experience.
Carrie, do you want to give your reply to what Julie just said?
Yes,
because obviously
of course,
you do represent people.
Every business is exploitative. Yes, we do represent some sex workers at various levels of areas of the sex industry. But the point is that Ms. Bindle claims to speak for sex workers and presents sex workers as victims. And I can tell you that, for 25 years, 25 years ago, sex workers in India were saying that do-gooders and moral crusaders were trying to save women from prostitution. Save women in various ways. NGOs, all sorts of people are coming forward and saying that prostitution is wrong. Women should be helped out of it. And women, women, if we are to have the right to say no, we have to have the right to say yes. That is also what sex workers are saying. And
Carrie says rightly so, that there's a real problem with the police not arresting those who harm women in prostitution, and that the police have got a dreadful, shameful track record in arresting the very women who actually deserve their protection and our protection. But there is a question to be asked, which is why do so many men attack and abuse and assault women in prostitution.
Because they can.
They're called punters, exactly. Now, some of them target women in street prostitution particularly because they know that they're vulnerable and that they know that they are likely to have a capture if it's a woman involved in prostitution because of the stigma on those women. But many of the men who attack women indoors, and there's an increasing bank of research on the levels of abuse of women indoors, not just outdoors, do it because they have a view of women which is that they are there as a piece of meat, a commodity who they can pay to do what they like to. There is no respect in that exchange in the vast majority of instances. And this is the problem. We can't just look to the police for not protecting the women. We have to look at why there are so many assaults on women, and also in legalised regimes. Because this is obviously what it comes down to, whether or not we want to legitimise pimping or not. In legalised regimes, what you have is the police completely removing themselves from the entire regime of prostitution because it's no longer a policing issue. So you've got less of a chance to get these abusive men.
A reminder that you're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on legalising prostitution. I'm joined by feminist writer Julie Bindel, porn star and prostitute Johnny Ongley, Carrie Mitchell from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Roger Matthews, a professor of criminology at the University of Kent. Johnny Ongley.
Can I just present an alternative picture, which is the side of prostitution that I do know, and this idea that everybody works. Yes, people do work on the streets, absolutely, but there are a couple of faces of prostitution. Now, the prostitution that I know is there's a website I use, and people there, men and women, gay, straight, advertise their services on there. It is completely open. You leave ratings about your customers. You leave ratings about the prostitute that you use. They call themselves escorts. They're prostitutes, basically. I know numerous women and men who advertise their services on there. They do it out of utter choice. They do it in a very open and frank way. So this idea, and also bear in mind that the people who are going to contact the police, the people who are going to contact Julie and going to tell their stories are the women who have had the bad experiences, are the women who have been abused, who have had the bad punters. You're not going to hear from the women who, particularly the women who advertise on places on adult work, who call themselves high-class escorts. They're prostitutes. They're not going to hear from them because they're the sort of women who are having good experiences of prostitution.
I met them in Nevada.
Let's bring in Roger. Roger, obviously, you said most of the women that you spoke to had bad experiences, but Johnny's saying that you're not going to hear from the good ones. They're not going to come forward and say, yes, I had a great time.
Yeah, we didn't interview women just because they had bad experience, didn't come forward. We interviewed a sample of women about all sorts of things and their experiences in prostitution. But what came out of the research, and this is, women working indoors and outdoors, was we were just surprised by the level of coercion and fear that a lot of these women live in on a day-to-day basis. And I think one of the surprising things that came out of it was that we'd known for a long time. I mean, we know that 65 women, for example, involved in prostitution have been murdered over the last 15 years. And again, in terms of the point that Carrie's making about reporting, and the difficulty of reporting, is if you think about the Stephen Wright case in Ipswich. I mean, one of the classic comments, I was at the Stephen Wright trial, and one of the classic comments made by one of the friends of one of the women who got killed was that when Stephen Wright apparently turned up on the evening, her comment was, "It's very nice to see a friendly face." So basically, some of these people who are very dangerous punters are not some sort of unknown psychopaths. I mean, these are people who are regular users, and how you police that, I really don't know.
Yes, Carrie Mitchell, how do you police that?
Well, what had happened in Ipswich, in fact, was shortly before the summer-autumn, before the Ipswich murders took place, was there had been a crackdown instigated by the local council and the police, and they had started to drive women out of the red light area, the local housing red light area where women were familiar, where the residents, many of the residents contacted afterwards and, said that they were happy to see, they weren't unhappy to have women on the streets there because they knew they could keep an eye and they could also see the way the police treated those women. Anyway, there had been a crackdown. And that, any crackdown, is a green light to violent men to come forward and murder women. And a number of those women were murdered outside of the red light area, in an industrial area where women had been driven to from that safer red light area, where women were more familiar and where they knew that there were residents who were, at least were used to their company. And that is one of the great dangers of encouraging any kind of raids. And in fact, tragically in Ipswich right now, the police are not only driving women off the streets, but they are raiding premises where women, they are prosecuting at the moment, premises where women are working together more safely. And that is the outrageous consequence of the increase in the repression of sex workers.
Julie
is
Bindle,
that women who do need help are less able to come forward, and the police are raiding widely and closing down premises where women are able to work more safely and are having to be driven not only out of the streets but into other less safe ways of working.
Julie Bindle, this crackdown isn't helping, is what Carrie's saying.
Well, no crackdown helps. What you need is a concerted effort to support people out of the industry. And what you saw that happened after Ipswich, which tragically was only implemented after 5 women had been murdered, was that they showed that they could actually help women, many of whom were chaotic drug users and extremely vulnerable, off the streets and out of prostitution, because actually women who are working and living in that level of chaos are not welcome in brothels. Their lives are too chaotic and they're too open to abuse and further exploitation. So yes, I agree, it absolutely helps nobody just having a crackdown. We need to stop criminalising the women, and we need to deter men from thinking that they have a God-given right to pay for sex. And we also need to recognise that this notion that it's inevitable that men will have to pay for sex or they will simultaneously combust is an absolute obscenity. What men are saying who support, and women who support the notion that men have to pay for sex or something terrible will happen, is that all men are potential rapists. It's not feminists who are saying that. It's those that say that if they don't pay for sex with a woman, then they'll have to go out and rape some poor innocent other woman. It's an outrageous view of masculinity and not one that any feminist I know shares.
Is that really a view that men share?
First of all, no, I certainly wouldn't say that if they don't have sex, they're going to combust or something terrible is going to happen to them. What I recognise is that people who do not have sexual fulfilment, and I'm not just talking about men, I'm talking about women as well, that we can all suffer from because we're not being sexually fulfilled in our lives. It can impact on other parts of our lives. And yes, much of the time we can just masturbate, or women can get out her rampant rabbit, and that will be perfectly helpful. But there are other times when the company of another human being is helpful. And as I was saying before, rather than going out on a Friday night, Saturday night, paying somebody to be a prostitute by proxy, by buying them drinks at a bar, getting them completely sloshed off their face, and then taking advantage of them later on in the evening, where they're probably less likely to be able to safely use contraception, less likely to actually give real consent to the sex that they're involved with, actually going and seeing somebody who's happy. And I want to stress that, happy to offer their service as a prostitute. I don't want people to be prostitutes who don't want to be prostitutes. I don't want to live in that world. Yes, it's a utopian ideal, but that's what we should be aiming for, not aiming to say, well, people who want to be prostitutes, they don't really want to be prostitutes. They don't really know what they think. I want people who want to be prostitutes, and then people who want to use the services of a prostitute to receive those services and do it in a respectful and open way.
John, I just want to put a question to you that Roger Matthews put up. But these familiar faces that could all of a sudden turn, it's not just the bad people that people say, stay away from them. What about a familiar face that might suddenly turn on someone? You said you check the photos of people, but is that really enough?
Well, no, it's not enough. I mean, I'd still put myself at risk, absolutely, by going to meet people that I don't know. I mean, I do speak to them beforehand. I do get pictures, and the main reason I get the pictures is so that I can make sure that in some way I can give them a service that they're going to be happy with. Because if I'm not attracted to them in any way whatsoever, or feel that I'm not going to have any real chemistry, there's no point me offering the service because I'm not going to fulfill their need. But mainly, yes, I do put myself at risk. And so if we had a much more legitimate, if we treated prostitution as a much more legitimate business, I mean, I'm even envisaging having an NHS-run, service where people can go and use prostitutes. We had a service which was much more regulated, then my safety, as well as the safety of the clients as well, and the thousands of women up and down the country, as well as the gay men, straight men who are involved in prostitution, because, they're at risk as well. Let's not forget
bring
that.
Carrie here.
Well, on the question of familiar face, 2 women a week are murdered by their husbands or partners. So it's not a question of, whether you happen to be a client, you might be a regular client who suddenly turns. We all know that women are most often murdered and raped by men who are familiar with them on that question. On the other question, Julie Bindel is talking about the notorious Swedish model, which has criminalised clients at least a number of years ago. And there, it has not, Swedish sex workers say, it has not made it safer. Women have been driven more underground because the connection between the client and the woman is now problematic, that women have to rely on a third party in order to contact clients. Women are having to, clients are more nervous, so that clients, for instance, are women on the street. Women are having to service clients who they would previously have told to go away. I'm not going to touch you.
Sure.
Because
Carrie's raising problems with
the
Swedish model.
made it safer for women in Sweden.
What about the model that Johnny brought up about this NHS kind of run?
Yes, well, we're never going to have that in this country, but the point is it has pretty much been tried in countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, where prostitution is seen as a service industry, and where social services, have, for example, a mobile home parked on the massive tolerance zone, pretty much one of the only ones left in Utrecht, about 35 kilometres away from Amsterdam, where they see, that their view of it is exactly as I was saying before, that men have a divine right to sex in the way that they do food and water. So, that hasn't worked. It gives the impression that this is something that we have to provide as women to men, and the levels of abuse and criminality that I saw when I visited that tolerance zone was horrendous, and it's exactly why they're closing down those zones, because of course if you trot out figures and statistics that women have never been murdered or harmed on a tolerance zone, for example, well, that may be the case, but what we do know is that those men are not stupid. They drive them away to wherever they choose to harm them. And the police in Utrecht have admitted that there are levels of criminality that are deeply worrying. There's underage prostitution, there's trafficking, and there are drug dealers hanging around the zone, because that's what prostitution brings with it.
Okay, final word to Roger Matthews. If the Julie says the NHS kind of plan, which Johnny brought up, wouldn't work, but also the kind of thing that we're seeing in Utrecht doesn't either, what method would?
Well, as I say, I think both of them. Obviously, the whole NHS idea is just absurd. The notion of toleration zones is only just slightly less absurd. Quite clearly, as Julie Bindel suggested, quite clearly doesn't work, which is why the Dutch authorities have closed most of them down. I think really the way forward is between Carrie's argument and Julie Bindel's argument. I think they both seem to agree that the decriminalisation of particularly street soliciting seems to be a positive move. I think combined with that, I think that we ought to help as many women to leave prostitution as we can. As many of those who want to get out should be given every assistance to get out. And if this government had any kind of progressive policy, which unfortunately it doesn't at the moment, then it would actually be putting money into existing programmes.
Roger Matthews, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to my guests, feminist writer Julie Bindel, porn star and prostitute Johnny Ongley, Carrie Mitchell from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Roger Matthews, Professor of Criminology at the University of Kent.
Brothels and whatever, all those forms of activity all come under some form of regulation.
Now, Johnny, you famously worked as a male prostitute. Do you see it as a business and a job like any other?
Yes, I do. I mean, it's a way of making a living for me, and the way I do it in a very open and honest way. I work for myself. I advertise my services on a website. I'm very open with the clients who want to contact me for my services. We speak beforehand. I usually ask for pictures to make sure I would be comfortable working with them. So it's a very honest and open contract, basically, I have with those people. And yes, it helps pay my bills, basically.
No, it's if you could remove the exploitation from the industry, if you you could remove the pimps and the profiteers, if you could remove the danger towards those actually working in the sex industry, and although you're hearing from Johnny, it is primarily women who are working in prostitution in the UK and certainly around the world, then that would be a different matter. The act of prostitution, the buying and selling of other people's bodies, particularly when it's men buying women, is not conducive to equality. So therefore it affects all women. It gives the impression that our bodies can be commodified. This isn't a moral argument. It's not an anti-sex argument. Sex is great. Sex is brilliant. The point is that when men feel that they can give money, give dollars, or whichever currency in order to rent the inside of a woman's body, then it devalues her and it creates the context in which men think that they can treat women as inferior.
Carrie Mitchell from the English Collective of Prostitutes. Is prostitution just a commodity?
Well, it's the exchange of sexual services for money, and it's sex between consenting adults, not to be confused with trafficking and rape, which is force. And we are campaigning and have been for a long time for decriminalisation of prostitution. That is, removing prostitution from the criminal law so that consenting sex between adults is not an offence, but rape, force, underage offences are still unlawful. The only place that decriminalisation has taken place successfully is in New Zealand, and there they have found there's been no increase in prostitution. And most importantly, because women don't fear being arrested, they're more able to come forward and report violence to the police. And also importantly, up to 4 women are able to work together collectively with nobody in charge, without requiring any kind of a special licence, so that this provides a choice for women, so that the power of the brothel owners.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Daniel Sinner with today's discussion on legalising prostitution. The Oxford Union, the prestigious debating society of Oxford University, has just hosted a debate on whether prostitution is a legitimate business activity. It's not the first time the union has courted controversy, but the topic is part of a wider discussion in British society about sexual freedom and the increasing sexualisation of society. There's a growing demand from campaigners to regulate prostitution, even though the act is not technically illegal at the moment. The aim is to make the world's oldest profession a safer activity for those involved. To discuss the issue, I'm joined by feminist writer and founder of Justice for Women, Julie Bindel, porn star and prostitute Johnny Ongley. Carrie Mitchell is from the English Collective of Prostitutes, and Roger Matthews is a professor of criminology at the University of Kent. Roger, I want to begin with you, Professor of Criminology. What do we mean when we say prostitution isn't illegal, but the activities around it, such as pimping, soliciting and brothel keeping, are?
Well, basically what it says, which is that the actual act of prostitution itself is not illegal in this country, but most of the ways in which you might engage in prostitution, and certainly those forms where prostitution involves, for example, working in